Good evening, everybody. It is now time for the my next lecture on crime and punishment. I'll probably do what I did in the last lecture and just talk a little bit through the events, some of the things that I think are particularly significant about the events taking place. Um, and again, I think that will, among other things, help you to maybe keep the characters straight because I know they can be little difficult to follow. Um, so I'm going to be starting with part 2, chapter 5, and that is when Luzhin arrives at Raskolnikov's apartment to meet with him. This is before his mother and sister have arrived, though he has had word from his mother's letter that that he will be coming by to see Raskolnikov. He has no idea what kind of shape Raskolnikov's in, what's been happening to him, recently. Luzhin clearly has gotten a new suit of clothes, is doing everything to appear really impressive, thinking that Raskolnikov might be somebody he's going to have to impress. And so, of course, that makes a very odd juxtaposition when Luzhin appears in the doorway of Raskolnikov's apartment and sees what poverty he's living in, how ill he is, etc. And again, he did have some of his friends there at the time too, Razumikin among them. So he comes in and he says, I think, you knew that I was going to be on my way. He mentions that he's staying at Lebziatnikov's apartment, with him. We find out that he's one of these new thinkers, one of these modern thinkers. And so I think we're supposed to assume that because Luzhin wants to appear to be somebody who's kind of on the cutting edge and following the youth movements, et cetera, that he wants to be around Lebziatnikov because he thinks he can learn more from him about this new scientific outlook on morality and ethics and politics and these sorts of things, various social issues, and that will impress Raskolnikov. We know that obviously it's not the case. So he comes to see him. They talk briefly. The issue of the murders does come up, and the fact that the people who had pledges with the pawnbroker were going to be examined. So he kind of learns about that, which is important. We later find out that he's the last one to actually go to the police office to talk to them about the fact that he had pawned something and that he wanted to get it back, that it was important to him. And there are actually 2 items, I think, that he had pawned. And I think he was hoping that it would make him look less guilty if he didn't go right away and try to get his things back. That he would, wait, make it seem like he wasn't really that interested or had nothing, had really no close connection with the pawnbroker or her death. And so his motivation for the murder couldn't have been that he wanted to get his pawned items back. But he ends up looking guilty because of that, because it looks like he is intentionally waiting to put the police investigator, especially Porfiry Petrovich, sort of off his track a little bit. This is one of a number of instances where, among other ways in which Raskolnikov kind of gives himself away, a major one obviously being his illness and his irritability, is the fact that he keeps overthinking things. And because he views himself as very bright as an intellectual and he thinks he could get away with this crime, commit the perfect crime, that he does not want to be caught out making a silly mistake, saying something that he shouldn't be saying or acting in a way he shouldn't be acting to the extent that he can control it. So in overthinking the issue of, I think, of the goods that he had pawned, it actually makes him look guilty. And I think he comes to realize this gradually with these encounters he's going to have with Porfiry Petrovich, who I described previously as almost a Socrates-like character in helping through kind of indirection to reveal the guilt of Raskolnikov. And that the Socrates was probably the basis for this 1970s murder mystery investigator named Columbo, who actually, when I sort of looked up Porfiry Petrovich and looked up the name as the character from the book, there were 3 or 4 photos of Columbo from his TV show, from Peter Falk's TV show, that showed up there. And he used to wear this old overcoat. He looked very absent-minded. He looked like he was clueless. And what he would do is kind of disarm people that way because they would get sloppy. But he knew exactly what he was doing. and was extremely bright. It's just a very interesting murder mystery show because of that. So Raskolnikov keeps getting in a position to overthink himself, and it actually does him harm. Razumikin is talking about the murder as well. People are noticing that even though Raskolnikov seems to be sort of in and out of um, being awake, that every time anybody mentions anything to do with the murders and the pawnbroker, that whole situation, and of course, lots of people are talking about that because it was right there in the neighborhood, that Raskolnikov seems to come to life. He seems to react just to that particular issue, which is why his doctor Zosimov calls him a monomaniac. You know, that somehow he's fixated on these murders, and they can't quite figure out why. Once Razumikin finds out from his friend Zamatov, who is one of the other police officers, that Raskolnikov had pawned some things and was interested in getting them back because they were given to him, one by his sister and one by his father, I think. That Razumikin thinks, okay, that's the reason he's fixated on these murders. He wants to get these items back that mean a lot to him, especially when his sister and mother come into town and they might ask him, you know, where's your watch? You know, those kind of things, and he's not going to have it. So that helped, I think, to put Razumikin off the track. However, Razumikin clearly knows exactly how the murder was committed. And that worries Raskolnikov. He doesn't know who committed it, but he's able to explain exactly how the jewelry was dropped behind the door. And I think I talked a little bit about this last time. You know, the two people that went to the apartment and realized that the door was chained, and the pawnbroker must be in there, and something must be wrong. And they both eventually left, the front of the door and allowed him to sneak out. He runs down the stairs. They're coming up the stairs. He hides on, I think it was maybe the third floor in an apartment. They can go the rest of the way up the stairs, and he runs out of the building. And Razumikin had all of this figured out. He does say that the murderer must have been a novice. And Porfiry Petrovich kind of picks up on this idea as well. And it really angers Raskolnikov because he doesn't want to appear as a novice. Almost for him, worse than being caught as the murderer is being portrayed as somebody who was a novice, who didn't think things through carefully, who is maybe not very bright, because that's the last thing he wants to, sort of appear here as somebody who wants to commit the perfect crime and who sees himself as one of these extraordinary people who can get away with committing crimes for some greater good. And of course, from the very beginning, after he commits the crimes, we realize that this idea of him having a greater good for what he was doing kind of falls by the wayside. But he kept telling himself that that's why he was doing it. But it kept really angering Raskolnikov when Razumikin says, oh, he was a novice. He couldn't find the money. There was lots of money there in the top drawer, and he didn't take it. He was rifling through clothes under the bed to find things. And he was just a sloppy murderer and sloppy thief. And as much as one might think that that might reflect positively on Raskolnikov, because indeed he's not a professional thief, he again wants to have committed the perfect crime. So it really frustrates him when people keep saying in front of him, gee, the murderer was just a real goofball, just made all these mistakes and was sloppy and didn't actually get much for the two murders that were committed. They do talk with Luzhin when he's there. Raskolnikov very much offends him, saying, you're never going to marry my sister. She's too good for you, and you're a fool. Razumikin is kind of taken aback by this because he knows that Raskolnikov is meeting Luzhin for the first time. But before too long, Razumikin develops the same opinion about Luzhin, that he is this person who has really had no redeeming qualities. We get to the next part of the book, and there's a very famous scene between Raskolnikov and Zamatov, one of the police officers, again, the one that was the friend of Razumikin, and that Razumikin has already spoken with about the murders. And they meet at the Palais de Crystal, which is kind of a bar restaurant sort of place. It's one of these times when Raskolnikov, he oscillates between wanting to be by himself and wanting to be with people. And so he goes to the Palais de Crystal, and he's interested in finding the newspapers from the last 5 days because he wants to see all the reporting that's going on about the murder, because he knows everybody's talking about it and they're aware of it in large part, as well as word of mouth through the newspapers. So he's reading the newspapers. He sees Zamatov, and I think he kind of thinks, okay, here's an opportunity for me to put him off my track. And he goes to Zametov and they sit together. He starts taunting him. He's saying he's reading about the murders and almost kind of saying, gee, if I was the murderer, why would I be doing this, reading the newspapers about the murder in front of somebody from the police office, right? And again, this is him trying to overthink things to put other people off the track in a way that ultimately backfires on him. Zametov, as I just said, insinuates also that the murderer must have been an amateur, which Raskolnikov just heard from Razumikin, so that really angers him again. I think Zametov is genuinely concerned about Raskolnikov and thinks that he's losing his mind because he seems to be acting so, acting so irrationally. And another thing that Raskolnikov does that he believes will totally put Zametov off his track as the potential murderer is he says, okay, if I was going to commit this murder as it's described in the paper, here's how I would have done it. And he describes it exactly how he did it. And again, he's sort of saying, gee, if I was the murderer, why would I be telling you that this is exactly how I committed the crime, right? And again, Zametov isn't, I think by himself, he's not quite clued in enough to see that that's Raskolnikov trying to put him off the track. I think Porfiry Petrovich is, and I think Zametov, when he has discussions with Porfiry Petrovich, they kind of figure out together what's going on, and Petrovich must explain to Zametov that, yeah, he's trying to put us off his track here. He then wanders out. He sees Razumikin on the way out, who's having a party. His uncle is in town. He's going to be living with his uncle, and they're putting on a party. He wants Raskolnikov to at least stop by. He thinks it'll be good for him. Raskolnikov says, no, I don't want to. And he wanders over to one of the bridges in the area and sees a woman attempt to drown herself by jumping off the bridge. And then we kind of realize that Raskolnikov maybe himself was considering, killing himself. This is one of the things that his options for how to deal with his life now. One is suicide. One is to turn himself in. The other is to do the best he can to go on with his life. He is trying to do the best he can to go on with his life, though he clearly is also at times contemplating suicide, or because he's so stressed out about things and ill about things, turning himself in. And he vacillates from one plan to the other, or one option to the other, throughout the vast majority of the book. But then he kind of realizes when he sees her jump off the bridge and is actually saved, that it kind of looks stupid. It was kind of embarrassing. And he imagines himself doing the same thing, jumping off the bridge, people seeing him and pulling him out of the water, and how idiotic that would look. And again, he's very concerned about his self-image and realizes that he's too good for, killing himself by jumping off a bridge. That's that's the kind of thing that common people do. Ordinary people, not extraordinary people like Raskolnikov. He then is on his way to the police station. And another one of the important scenes here, and again, this book is made up of all of these choreographed situations. In television, they talk about situation comedies. These are sort of situation tragedies, I guess you might say, where there are certain people together and they're talking about issues that are very personal to them. And again, somebody gets really embarrassed or upset and angry, and there's confrontation, and they create all kinds of really great drama. And it's one of the reasons I think that this that the people made a movie about, or maybe more than one movie about the story, and a play, because it is in these various set pieces that you can really do well in a theatrical sort of way. And so the next one is when he sees Marmeladov. He sees a carriage had run over somebody who apparently had drunkenly stumbled in front of it. Nobody knows who this person is. Raskolnikov realizes that it is Marmeladov, right? The drunk gentleman who had been working for the government, and his alcoholism has led him to lose his job multiple times, and he's taking money from his family, and his daughter Sonia is prostituting herself to help the family make money, and he's stealing some of that money for his alcohol, just really in a bad way. And he's in bad shape after he'd been run over by this carriage. His skull is crushed in on one side, and he's barely alive. And here, this is, again, we see these moments when all of a sudden Raskolnikov does become an extraordinary person, in a sense, but he does it in a really positive way, not in a destructive way, or in a way that's directly positive and that shows compassion, right? And this is one of those instances, right? Just like we know that he tried to save the girl in the street who looks like this, a guy was after her to take advantage of her. It looked like she'd already been taken advantage of. And he gives the policeman money to take her home. He leaves money at Marmalade Elf's house when he takes him back after he had gotten drunk and been sleeping on a barge for several days. And here again, he does a good deed, right? He says, I know who this person is. He lives nearby, right? Just give me a second here. And Marmalade Elf's a bloody mess. And he, Raskolnikov gets all this blood all over him. And so we have these two different instances where Raskolnikov ends up with blood all over himself. One is from the murders that he committed, the pawnbroker to her sister, Lizaveta, and the other is from trying to save the life of Marmalade Elf. And so this is one of these interesting contrasts, I think. Just like the contrast between this extraordinary individual who does really horrible things, supposedly for some greater good, and the kind of extraordinary individual that we see at moments that Raskolnikov can be and trying to come to people's aid. They carry the body back to Marmalade Elf's apartment. His wife sees him. She's really angry, and then she realizes what bad shape he's been in. She hasn't seen him since he went off to work several days prior. And there's this really powerful scene. And I will share with you a kind of an artist rendering of this, again, very powerful scene with in the apartment where Marmalade Elf is and his wife and their children. And it's clear that Marmalade Elf is not going to live much longer. And so they call for a doctor. And he says he's going to be dead in the next 10, 15 minutes. He doesn't have a chance. Marmalade Elf himself calls for a priest, and so he can, get last rites. And he everybody then sees, and this is one of these, again, real dramatic moments in this particular set piece, that Sonia, they've gone to find Sonia, right, who's actually his real daughter. The other children are from his second wife, her children. Send for Sonia. Sonia comes back, and there's this scene where here she is dressed in her outfit that she uses when she's doing her work, right, when she's walking the streets or however she met the gentleman who she would prostitute herself with. And so she's wearing these very cheap clothes that are gaudy nonetheless, and it's a very embarrassing kind of scene, especially for Marmalade Elf's wife, because Katerina is very, very ill and in bad shape, but she's also very proud, and she kindly holds over her the woman who she rents the apartment from, the fact that she's from, a well-to-do family, etc. Again, I know I've talked about this before, and the woman who she always rent to is actually German in origin, which she thinks makes her inferior. And so Katerina is really concerned about keeping up appearances. That's why she stays up all night washing the children's clothes, and anytime they have any extra money at all, she tries to buy them new clothes so they look good. So she is obviously the person who's probably the most taken aback by seeing Sonia come in dressed as she is, and really everybody could identify exactly what line of work that she's in here. And Marmalade does see her briefly before he passes away, and she comes over to him, and he kind of dies in her arms, as it were. And it's obviously a really important scene here in the book. And Raskolnikov, again, these are those instances where he's rejuvenated. Now he has a reason to live again. And his reasons to live, again, have to do with helping other people in various kinds of ways. And so he, gives Katerina Ivanova more money, and says, you can use this for the funeral, and says, I'll be back for the funeral. And then he's leaving the apartment. He's going down the stairs, and Katerina is one of her children. A daughter, Polenka, comes down the stairs to ask him, what's your full name? Where do you live? And again, she sees that Raskolnikov, how compassionate he seems to be. And he asks her if she says her prayers at night. She says she does. And he said, pray for me. And basically says, and not in these words, but that he will take care of the family. And I think, again, this is a really important scene here. And then Raskolnikov leaves and gets back to his apartment, and there his mother and sister are there waiting for him. They had arrived, and they're in St. Petersburg now for the first time. That brings us over to part 3 of the book. And in chapter 1, excuse me, they see what bad shape he's in his apartment. They've been there with Nastasia. She let them in and has talked a little bit about Raskolnikov's condition, and I think that kind of prepares them a little bit to see him when he gets there, what bad shape he's in. But they're still really taken aback by it. He definitely is very ill, thin. Again, the color yellow appears, and his clothes are dirty and yellowed, and his skin is yellowed, and wallpaper is yellowed, and all these other things that suggest illness. And so they try to have a conversation. Raskolnikov is happy to see them, but he also is upset that they're seeing him in the condition that he's in, and that's sort of upsetting for him. Razumikin and Zosimov are there, and you can tell that they're very attracted to Raskolnikov's sister, Dunya, who Dostoevsky describes as somebody who was very attractive, intelligent, just all positive qualities he uses, and even describes her mother and Raskolnikov's mother as sort of an older version of the same person, the same person 20 years older, whatever the age difference is. And so, these are really good people. And I think that really strikes Razumikin too. And I think makes him more committed to helping Raskolnikov. The other thing that does this is his attraction to Dunya that he has right away. He's come from this party that he's having with his uncle, who he's moved in with, and he's very inebriated, and he does some embarrassing things. And again, the issue of the murders comes up, and Raskolnikov again sort of seems to come alive whenever the murders are mentioned. Zosimov says he's not insane, but he is definitely a monomaniac, so that idea comes up again. And they're shown, Raskolnikov is shown a letter from Luzhin, who, after Luzhin has met with Raskolnikov the first time, saying that I never want to see your brother again. If you want to marry me, you'll never see him again. And that he's going to be meeting Dunya and her mother the next day, and Raskolnikov shouldn't be there. And if he's there, I'm going to leave. And so he's kind of saying you have to choose between me and your brother, and really believes that he is such a kind of a savior figure for Dunya that she would do anything, put up with anything, to marry him and not be living in poverty anymore. And he really thinks that with her by his side, he can climb the social ladder, because she is very bright and fairly well educated and attractive and all these kind of things that people would want to be around him, etc. So to kind of have a wife like that with him, he thinks would help advance his own cause, and that she wouldn't leave him because she'd be beholden to him. Again, because all she has on other than that is a possible life is living in this great poverty. So that scene comes to an end, and Raskolnikov says to them, do you want me to be there? And Dunya says, yes, I want you to be there, even though Luzhin said no. So we know there's going to be a big confrontation, as again is every one of these set pieces is going to happen again. Dunya and her mother are very concerned about the shape that Raskolnikov is in. But they need to get back to the apartment that they're staying in, which is in a really bad place. And Razumikin again says, well, Luzhin really is a scoundrel. Why would he let them stay at this horrible place? And more you see him agreeing with Raskolnikov that this Luzhin guy is no good. So he says, I know you're worried about Raskolnikov, so I'm going to walk you home, and then I'm going to come back and check on him, and I'm going to make sure that the doctor comes back and checks on him, Zosimov, and then I'll come see you, and I'll let you know at the end of the night how he's doing, so you can get some sleep, and then we'll see you the next day. But there's another interesting part of the book where Razumikin is walking Dunya and her mother to the place that they're staying, and he's very inebriated, and they can tell he's inebriated, but they also can tell that he seems really genuinely to care about Raskolnikov, and to be somebody that maybe they can trust, even though he's very inebriated. And he does all kinds of embarrassing things. It's very clear that he's really attracted to Dunya. In public, he gets down on his knees and says, "I'm not worthy of you," and they're embarrassed and get up and whatever else. And he takes him to the apartment, and after he leaves, they're sort of trying to figure out who this Razumikin guy is. Dunya's mother is a little concerned about him and whether or not he's trustworthy. Dunya seems to think that, yeah, he's a good guy, and he's somebody we can trust, and believes that he actually is going to take care of Raskolnikov and will show up a couple hours later, even though it's already fairly late and he had been inebriated. And that, I think, kind of seals the deal that Razumikin is somebody that they can trust, because in his state, with a party going on in his apartment, he actually does get the doctor to see Raskolnikov and does come back and see him at the end of the night. They don't necessarily know that's because he's kind of instantly fell in love with Dunya, but the other part of it is he really does care about Raskolnikov. So we then move on to the next scene, where Raskolnikov is at his apartment, and Sonia comes to see him, and Dunya and her mother are there. So we get this scene where she kind of walks in. Luzhin had told a fib in his note to Dunya and her mother that they heard that Raskolnikov gave the money to this prostitute who's a low-life person, and he's wasting your money, and he knows that it's money that she gave Raskolnikov from her pension, because he knows he didn't give him any money, as you might think he would have. And so she comes in, and Sonya's embarrassed, I think, but she did come by his apartment, and to say that mother really wants you to be at the funeral, and I want you to be there too. And there is going to be a funeral lunch, was something they did, at the time after these funerals. Sometimes these days you have a kind of reception or a family get together after funerals, and it's the same sort of idea here. And they're going to use some of Raskolnikov's money that he gave them to actually have this funeral lunch. It is a kind of extravagance, which does maybe look a little bad to Dunya and her mother, because they know it's her mother's money that actually is being used for this. But again, this is Marmeladov's wife trying to, again, maintain this. I think Katerina's her name. I keep forgetting. To maintain this sense of being a well-born, educated person, that when you have money, you have these kind of funeral lunches, and you have good food and people over, and so it's a lot of it is for appearance's sake, but that's really all she has left in her life. In a lot of ways, she's not going to be living much longer. Clearly, her consumption is getting worse. And so I think Dunya and her mother don't really know what to think of Sonia at first, but they definitely see that she seems to be relatively, harmless. And they find out that Luzhin had slandered her in saying that she was, making it seem as though she was a prostitute because that was the career choice she made, other than the fact that, she's actually a deeply religious person who thinks she might be putting her her soul in peril by doing this just to save her family. And there are interesting parallels that are made. Some of them already appeared between Dunya as sacrificing herself, first to Svidrigailov, who she worked for, even though he was trying to take advantage of her, and then potentially to Luzhin, to do what's right for her family, even though she doesn't love him, and would allow her maybe to be abused. And we see Sonia doing the same kind of thing, sacrificing herself for her family. So you have these two women who I think Raskolnikov kind of sees a lot of elements of Dunya and Sonia in one another. But he's the odd man out here, right? Because he's the one who did the horrible thing and has sinned and put his soul in peril for no real reason, right? And so again, these contrasts, I think, between the characters are important here. So then we find out that there's there are two people that have been sort of following Raskolnikov and his friends around. One we find out is somebody who is actually followed Raskolnikov when he went back to the apartment where the murders were committed, and he's kind of in a really bad state. He kind of just wanders in, goes up the stairs, and there are people in the apartment who are getting it ready to rent to somebody else. And he said, "Where'll all the blood go?" And he has this vision, a sort of a dream of trying to kill the pawnbroker as he did the first time, and she won't die. And it's just very disturbing dream that he has. And this person has been following him around, trying to pick up evidence that the police can use, because Porfiry Petrovich clearly thinks that Raskolnikov is guilty of the crime. And it almost seems like he knew from the very beginning, and that he was just that the whole story is basically him trying to make Raskolnikov unravel. This is what happens in the TV show Columbo. It's the exact same thing. Columbo, the investigator, knows 10 minutes into the show who the murderer was, and the next 50 minutes are trying to get the person to fall apart. And so that's what happens in the story here. The other person that's following people around is Svidrigailov, who has arrived in St. Petersburg. We find out that his wife had died under questionable circumstances. It seems like they may have had an abusive relationship. We know that Svidrigailov is interested in young girls, that he tried to seduce Dunya and take advantage of her and use his power over her. So, he's sort of bad news. And we find out he's living right next door to where Sonia is living, which again is setting up another one of these interesting set piece kind of interactions between the characters here. And chapter 4 ends with Razumikin and Raskolnikov going to see Porfiry because he needs to tell him that, I did have these items that I pawned and I want to get them back. They're family heirloom kind of things, or they mean a lot to me, even though they're not really valuable. And that's when he finds out he's the last person to come back and get his stuff. And he wants to put Porfiry Petrovich off the trail again. So he teases Razumikin about his clear attraction to Dunya in a way that kind of makes Razumikin kind of mad at him, and he teases him and laughs at him. And so they walk into Porfiry's sort of office in this kind of jovial attitude. So it's kind of like Raskolnikov acting in a way that you wouldn't act if you had just committed a horrible double murder, right? And that he's psychologically in better shape again, that he's back to his old self, and he's gotten over what happened and what he did, etc. So he wants to again use that to put Porfiry off the track, but it's so obvious that this was something that he's trying intentionally to do. Again, he outthinks himself. He says, well, what can I do to put him off the track? I'll act like I'm happy and jovial and doing well again and life is great, and that'll put him off the track. And it does, again, the exact opposite because of how bright this Porfiry Petrovich guy is. Very interestingly, Raskolnikov is there in the office, and we find out, and this is a real important scene from chapter 5, that Raskolnikov actually wrote an article and sent it off to a publication, to a journal, about his views about crime and this idea of the extraordinary man, or the Napoleon character. And who is an extraordinary person, who's kind of a mover and shaker, makes things happen in the world, will do extraordinary things as an extraordinary person, and therefore can commit maybe horrible crimes in the name of of doing these great deeds. And there's reference there to all the the things that Napoleon did during his conquests, and a special mention made of allowing his army to fall apart in front of Moscow. That's a major scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace, and a lot of it has to do with the conflicts involving Prussia and Germany and Russia and France, as Napoleon is out on his conquest. So it's sort of interesting to compare and contrast Tolstoy's way of talking about Napoleon more based on the history of what actually happened, and then seeing the portrayal that Dostoevsky makes as seeing him as this extraordinary person. And again, we see this reflected in Nietzsche's writings. and a lot of those, I think, occurred not too long after. I actually think I had some dates here for when Nietzsche was doing some of his writing. And I know I mentioned last time you said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist, as he calls him, that he ever really had anything to learn from. Right? Crime and Punishment was 1866. Nietzsche lived from 1844 to 1900, and wrote some of his work where he's kind of introduces us to the kind of the Superman idea, which you also see in Ralph Emerson's writing. He talks about the oversoul in one of his essays, The American Man of Letters, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who sometimes is called the red, white, and blue Nietzsche, because he's not as extreme as Nietzsche, but he does really believe everybody needs to strike out on their own path and make their own way in life and not just follow other people. And that's especially important for Emerson because, America is trying to develop its own culture, its own music, its own literature, and not just have to borrow from other cultures, sort of the way that the Russian people felt like they had to do for a time. And again, there was that Slavophile reaction against it. So it was 20 years or so after that point that Nietzsche started, did some of his writings that definitely reflect some of these same kind of ideas. It turns out that the Raskolnikov sent off this article, and the journal kind of went out of business. It folded, and Raskolnikov thought the article never went anywhere. He didn't know that another journal had actually picked it up, and it was published. And so there's this kind of cool thing where Razumikin says, "Hey, you're a published author. Isn't that great?" And then Porfiry Petrovich gives his account of what Raskolnikov says in a way that shows that he can see how Raskolnikov at least wants to think of himself as one of these extraordinary people in the way he talks about this article. And it's Razumikin is really taken aback because he doesn't believe in this idea of bloodshed by conscience, as it's called, that this seems really horrible, to him. And how can Raskolnikov ever even entertain these ideas? Another thing that he mentions, which is really important here, is that there's a connection between crime and illness that Raskolnikov talks about. And this is another thing that Porfiry Petrovich plays up, because clearly it shows a connection between Raskolnikov's illness and him having committed these murders. It's not just that he's living in poverty and is out of work and down on his luck, etc., and depressed. That his illness can potentially be related to having committed these murders. So this is a really important scene because I think it's the first time that the reader really sees that Petrovich is really on his trail, and he's going to do what he can in these encounters that he has with Raskolnikov to try to get him to unravel. And it's this cat and mouse game. And Raskolnikov will become increasingly angry at this because he does not want to be played like it's a cat and mouse game. And so the future encounters between Petrovich and Raskolnikov are really interesting because it's kind of like they're trying to outwit each other because they're both obviously very bright. So that scene is important. This is I'm not sure if this is from one of the plays or a film. There are lots of pictures of representations of Raskolnikov might look like when he's with Porfiry Petrovich, and that's sort of the picture you get here. And you can see the person playing the role here clearly looks like the way Raskolnikov is kind of described. It's kind of thin and emaciated, but dark features, dark hair, relatively attractive. And then you see Petrovich, who's actually looking fairly relaxed here in this particular picture. So Raskolnikov does go back to his apartment, and there is this stranger that approaches him in the street and calls him a murderer. He's really worried that he's been figured out. And we'll see this person sort of show up again. And Raskolnikov, he keeps trying to legitimate what he did, or when he tries to, by thinking about the fact that he murdered the pawnbroker, and he tries to push out of his mind the fact that he murdered Lizaveta. That gets harder and harder because we find that Sonia and Lizaveta were very close friends. both deeply religious, and they prayed together about their lives and their circumstances. And so, Sonia really obviously misses Lizaveta a lot. And as Raskolnikov develops an attachment to Sonia, it becomes harder for Raskolnikov to think that he just married this pawnbroker who was a really nasty, ugly person and just made everybody miserable. That he also murdered, right, this Lizaveta, who was, if simple-minded, at the same time, somebody who obviously did not deserve to die. And then when he awakens, Svidrigailov is standing in his door and has come by to visit him. And this is where we find out that his wife is dead, but that she left money for Dunya that she will be receiving. And I think it's a couple thousand rubles. And he says, if I'm allowed to see her one more time to help convince her not to marry this Luzhin character because he's a bad dude. He knows him because Luzhin was I think relatives of his wife, or his now deceased wife. That he has 10,000 rubles that he will provide Dunya, and I think he thinks that that's something she can't turn down. And he keeps saying, "I'm not infatuated with her anymore. I just don't want her to be around Luzhin. He's a bad guy, and I know she needs this money." And I'll stop right there because that brings us to part 4, which is what your reading assignment was up to at this point. So we'll stop there. I hope you found that sort of informative. You will have discussion questions due on the 19th. So I'll make sure that those are published in Canvas. And now for the 19th, you'll have to read up through part 5. So for later this week, the end of the week is part 4. For Monday is part 5 and the discussion questions. And then on the 21st is the part 6 in the epilogue. And the epilogue, again, is really important. And I will be doing a lecture kind of wrapping things up sometime in the evening of the 21st. So I hope everybody's doing well and hopefully getting something out of these lectures. As you can tell, this is a book that I really find enjoyable, if disturbing at times. And I hope some of you are enjoying it as well. So I will see you next time.